Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Right. Good evening, everybody. I'm going to provide some insights into stratigraphy after more than 50 years of studying. I'm going to give it in the form of some basics, some history, and some suggestions with particular reference to Indonesia and Southeast Asia. I'm going to go quickly through the initial slides, the basic ones, and if you need more full review of them, they will be made available to you. I'll also go fast through most of the rest of these slides because I have a lot of ground to cover and hopefully leave some time for some questions at the end. It's hard to know when stratigraphy first started, but there are records from China from nearly 1,000 years ago, and shown here are the famous Taihang Mountains, which provided fossils that were obviously marine to the at that time. So we know from nearly 1,000 years ago that people were collecting fossils and realized that there were strata which were marine. Anyone who has read Leonardo da Vinci's writings will be surprised by his very sensible geological observations of strata and fossils from the Tuscany region, even by his geological mapping. So this is, as you can see, about 500 years ago, and he even described clay stones and how they were deposited. Clearly a very clever man. He was also very outspoken, as you can see. He was lucky. He was able to, he could state the deluge and the flood concept was a myth, and he didn't suffer for it. He suffered for other things, but not for that. I'm sure you know the two main ways to define rocks. That's firstly by their lithological characteristics, and secondly by their relative age. However, people can forget. As you will see, many geologists forget this distinction. In fact, it's so prevalent that it is a major problem. Keep it in mind at all times. That's probably one of the lessons I'd suggest that you take away from this. Always think two divisions, lithostratigraphy and relative age. Lithostratigraphy, naming and recording lithologies, was something that Leonardo da Vinci did. We know that lithostratigraphy extends back at least 500 years. However, the formal naming of lithostratigraphic units only began at the end of the 19th century. Here you can see he defined what was called the Agile Azure, that's the blue clay, and this formation is, well, it's become a formation and it's still used today. These are the formal lithostratigraphic groupings as defined by the USGS over 100 years ago. You will know these, but to restate them very quickly, formations are defined by having one predominant lithology at type location, and they must be mappable. However, many strata remain unnamed, particularly outside of North America is pretty well defined by lithostratigraphy. In other places, this is not the case. I'm not going to go over all the places. That's for another lecture or for another time. When lithostratigraphic naming is applied, it can be difficult to decide how many formations are needed. You've just heard from Professor Marinata of some of those problems. Usually there are actually too few names, 2,000 names for that. There's not enough. I would suggest you probably need 5,000 or 10,000 names for the whole of Indonesia. For petroleum geology, where tracing reservoirs is obviously the most very important matter, correlating formations is as important as time correlation. It sounds obvious, but it's surprising how often only time correlation is considered. Moving on, the second group is obviously chronostratigraphy. This is actually best called rock time or time rock stratigraphy. It started about 200 years ago, much more recent than lithostratigraphy. Obviously, you saw the rocks first before you realized what the fossils were telling you. And attempts to correlate rocks based on their relative age started. We now have formalized systems, series, stages, and sequences. If it begins with S, it's likely to be a time rock unit or a chronostratigraphic unit. And we have names such as Jurassic, Cretaceous. They're all originally chronostratigraphic, or rather they are time rock units. It refers to rocks deposited anywhere over a particular relative time in an interval anywhere on Earth. It didn't need to be specific time interval, because obviously that came later. Now, chronostratigraphic units are rocks. This is where the problem starts. This simple fact has become confused. The International Commission on Stratigraphy calls them tangible stratigraphic units. I think a tangible stratigraphic unit is a rock. They mean rocks, and they also refer to rock bodies, as you can see. Here are some quotes direct from the International Commission on Stratigraphy. Chronostratigraphy is the element of stratigraphy that deals with the relative time relations and ages of rock bodies. Right, chronostratigraphic charts. Placing lithological units into a time framework was the original definition of chronostratigraphy. This is what chronostratigraphy was. Chronostratigraphy was not originally in rock units. It was actually placing lithostratigraphy in an age framework. The most well-known version is called a Wheeler diagram, but obviously he wasn't the first, but he was the most famous. Chronostratigraphy can be at a local scale within a basin. It doesn't have to be global. We have sequences now, which are local chronostratigraphic units. And if they're applied on a global scale, we call them systems or series or stages. These some rather interesting things on these diagrams, but I don't think I have time today to go through them. Other than if you ever get a chance to read Grabau 1913, I'd suggest that's a very good book to read, because he had some very good insights into stratigraphy. Derek Ager was a geologist in the 70s. He got very frustrated by the lack of clear stratigraphic definitions. He campaigned for clear stratal boundaries to be agreed by everybody. He said, let's make an arbitrary decision to define the basis of every stratigraphic unit, get on with the real work of stratigraphy. However, easy to say, not easy to do. To actually agree and define the basis has required enormous amounts of work and effort, and this is still ongoing. So 50 years on, we're still struggling. We come to the International Commission on Stratigraphy. This is the most international of the groups. It includes obviously China, Russia, and it's UN funded, etc. It started in 1974, a year after Derek Ager started saying things. It concerns itself with global boundary strata type sections and points. I might have to say that again, global boundary strata type sections and points. They're summarized, we call them GSSPs or even spikes. I'll come on to that. They also publish guides and charts. You can see there was a stratigraphic guide in 76 and one in 94. Charts are always coming along. There's one or two every year. I will show you one. I will show you the very latest chart. These are published regular basis of last year, but it was actually published in November. So it's 2 months old, this chart. And there was another one in 2020 earlier on. This latest chart, let's see if you can see my, maybe I should, let me give you a pointer option. That might help. There you go. Right. This chart has on it, it now has a spike here for the base of the Campanian. That's new. All the age dates in the Jurassic are now new as of last year. And there's still several missing. And some of the age dates are not necessarily final. There's three you can see in the Cenozoic here, which have yet to be agreed. Now, the importance of the Chinese contributions is indicated by the logo here. That is the Chinese symbol for mountain and indicates that there's quite a few Chinese contributions to this international chart, which the ICS is a subsidiary of the International Union of Geological Sciences, again, mainly UN UNESCO funded. Interesting charts. I'm not going to go through all the details. I'm going to go through a few details that are relevant, which are going to be on the Cenozoic. GSSPs, let's call them spikes, are set into rock sections around the world. They're spikes and they're hammered into rock sections in different places. Stages were originally defined in fossil-rich marginal sections, often with unconformities for obvious reasons. But this has now changed, and over the last 50 years, these stage boundaries have been moved to sections that show continuous deposition without any obvious unconformities. They wanted to choose places without any unconformities. Very often they're fossil poor, and of course, they may have caused as many problems as they've solved. So they've moved them to different countries from their original stage definitions. We have fairly good definitions for most original stages, particularly from places like France and other places. I've indeed worked on several, and they're usually very rich in fossils. But now we've moved to less fossil-rich sections in the middle of basins and in different countries. But that's what we're doing, or rather, that's what the ICS. The ICS has obviously contributed to the confusion of time and rocks. I'm not sure they did this purposely, but you notice on these charts, we have time here, we have rocks, which are systems, and we have period, which is time. And the two are put together, and the whole lot is mixed together. Have uppers and lowers and earlies and uppers and lates, a complete mixture, which I don't think has helped. In fact, I know it hasn't helped. It has caused confusion because in 2004, the GeolSoc London group tried to suggest that we eliminate chronostratigraphy, that we only have lithostratigraphy and we only have time, geologic time. They suggested getting rid of chronostratigraphy all the time. This was pretty well resoundingly defeated, and as far as I'm aware, it's gone away. I did speak to them a few years ago, and they were a bit embarrassed that they'd actually raised this proposal. But we're still left with chronostratigraphy and geologic time being confused. It probably doesn't help that it's called chronostratigraphy. I mean, that's correct, but time rock stratigraphy is probably a better term. So this is the Cenozoic. I'll come back to that in just a minute. Now, the separation of rocks and time is relatively simple. You should know what a rock is and what time is. Lower and upper refer to rocks, not surprisingly, and early and late refer to time, not to rocks. So if you say late, you mean you're late, it's time. If you say upper, it's something tangible, it is a rock. However, this is one of the commonest errors made. The geologic literature is replete with people saying lower when they mean early. If we look at the Cenozoic for Southeast Asia, Cenozoic is most relevant. We just about know how to say it. I can just about say it. I don't know if you can say it. It's spelled different ways, and it's most relevant, but it still can be confusing. They've tried to eliminate the tertiary system. I think they've failed. They have got rid of the tertiary by calling it the Paleogene and the Neogene. But I'm pleased to report the tertiary is alive and well in Southeast Asia. I just saw it on one of Professor's charts, so it's still alive. Paleogene and Paleocene don't help. We have two confusing names, which I'm not sure we even know how to spell them, but they sound somewhat similar. And you notice that we have formal subdivisions of things like the Miocene and the Pliocene in terms of where the divisions between lower and upper are, but we don't for the Oligocene and Eocene and Paleocene. So you're forgiven for having a problem. And also any global stratigraphy, these spikes are nowhere near Southeast Asia. So if you think you're going to correlate from here to Southeast Asia, I think you'll have a hard time. So that's chronostratigraphy. What about geologic time? I think geologic time is very important. Perhaps not well understood always by geologists. Until 100 years ago, there was very little agreement on the amount of geological time involved in geology, yet alone whether even time had a beginning or whether it was unidirectional. In fact, most people didn't believe time had a beginning. Grabau's estimate in 1913, here's Grabau again, he gave a very good review of, he calculated how old the Phanerozoic, that's since the Cambrian, he calculated how old the Phanerozoic would be by looking at around the world at deposition sections and how much time he thought they needed, and he calculated 27 million years, which is about 5% of what we now estimate. I actually think this is interesting because it means 95%, if he was right, 95% of the time is not represented by any deposition. And that's not a bad estimate. So we probably only have 5% of geologic time represented by strata. Just a bit of historical fun, which is we can see that previously people have estimated the age of the Earth based on biblical or cooling. Not a bad idea, but obviously we now know that the Earth has simply been hot and cool, so these are obviously not relevant anymore. But at the other extreme, we had James Hutton, another famous geologist. He concluded that time was eternal. Not only that it was eternal, in other words, didn't have a start, but he said it was ever cyclic. So he didn't believe it started and it ended. So there was, this perhaps wasn't widely held by many people, but several people thought that time's just cycled round and round and round. Some people might be coming back to that view now, but that's another matter. I haven't got time to go into that. Lyell was another famous, very influential man. He said time was incalculable. In other words, you couldn't have a beginning and you couldn't calculate how it was. Back to clear direction. So he initially didn't think it went in one direction, but later he came to accept that time was probably direction. And he then said it's punctuated by but he was very clear that therefore, as a result of this, that not all processes had uniformity of rate. Originally, he thought everything was the same rate, but then he changed his mind. He liked to show the Pozzuoli pillars. These are in Italy. He was always putting this in his books. These columns have marine borings here. Look, this is marine borings, and that's why he wanted to show it. They're a few meters above the ground. They show that the area had sunk and risen again in recorded time. This is local tectonism, and clearly what we can draw from it today is that tectonism can easily outpace eustatic sea level changes. That's what this tells you. That's what we now know from Southeast Asia, and I will come on to that point. It wasn't until the last century, very recently, that radiometric dating started. It started in 1907, but it didn't get very good until the 40s or 50s. It was agreed. It was in 1956 that it was agreed the solar system and the Earth was 4.54 billion years old. And that's the figure still used today on the geologic charts, on everything. But then later on, very recently, only 10 years ago, it was calculated that the universe is actually 13.77 billion years old. So you can see the universe is a lot older than the Earth and the solar system. Quite a lot, more than 3 times as old. It was agreed. The start was suggested by Georges Lemaitre. He suggested that the start of the universe had been an explosion, and somewhat in jest, Fred Hoyle in 1949 called it the Big Bang. And I think that's pretty well stayed with us, and we tend to use the Big Bang as the start of the universe. So as far as I know, that's what most geologists understood. We still we don't do much beyond the age of the Earth normally, but we do reckon that the age of the Earth is 4.54 billion years. Okay, I've almost finished on time. Most geologists now accept that the Earth had a beginning, that Earth's history was punctuated by major events. I expect most of you believe that. Astronomers and physicists, though, are developing more complex understandings of time, and I haven't got time to go into them. But be prepared in the next few years that some other concepts of time may come along. At the moment, we have a Big Bang 13.77 billion years ago. Then we have the 4.54, we have the solar system forming in here. So you can see here's the solar system and Earth and other things forming. So that's our current view. Now, seismic horizons. This, I'm glad Prof made this point, but I'll make it again. Seismic horizons are timelines. This has been known since the mid-70s, and we saw the 1976 Vail, who I actually worked with for some time. But it's sometimes forgotten. It's not always clear. Some people still think that seismic horizons are representing lithostratigraphy. They're not, so you shouldn't use them to map lithostratigraphy. Please do not use seismic horizons to map lithostratigraphy. You're making a mistake, or almost certain to make a mistake if you do that. Most seismic horizons result from the subtle merging of many seismic reflectors. Even the seabed as an example of merging of reflectors. The seabed comprises many different lithologies, and yet if you look at it on a seismic line, it's effectively one seismic horizon. And that's happened always in times past. Doesn't matter what the lithology is, the seismic horizons that you join up or likely to join up are time markers. So we have to really absorb that point. That is actually why ESO in the 70s decided that their seismic stratigraphy was leading nowhere and they'd better publish it and stop it as fast as they could. And they realized that if they drilled a well in a seismic horizon, which had sand in it in one place, that if they moved a few kilometers away and drilled, it probably didn't have sand. So they realized that seismic markers, seismic horizons were no good for tracing lithology. We've got to remember that still today. Okay, if we move to unconformities, there's a nice unconformity shown here. This is a deep cross section from 1836. It's hard to find a good deep cross section even today. This one is from 1836 from an interesting fellow called William Buckland. And it was outstanding. So I only put it as an intro to unconformities, but I give some homage to William. Definitions of unconformities have varied, but in general, the word unconformity is used when there's evidence of angularity. I don't think I need to go through this in detail. It's there if you want to. It was Bob Mitchum of ESO that defined an unconformity as almost anything you want. But we tend to keep the word unconformity to surfaces with an angular discordance, not so. Unconformities can be complex, but their size, particularly the area that they involve, is an important property. Significant unconformities are usually named so as to assist with their description and extent. Here you can see this one's called the Priscan unconformity, this one's called the Mid-Cimmerian unconformity. It's probably a good idea to name significant unconformities. I think that's typically done. There's quite a few. The only issue is how far, just like with lithostratigraphy, how many names you use and how far you extend them. Okay, but in sequence stratigraphy, non-angular unconformities and parent unconformities are usually termed correlative unconformities. I'll come to it. And to let you know that scale and resolution is important. For good vertical resolution, outcrop or well data is needed. You can see the type of resolution here. If you want to understand sequences or unconformities, you need lateral resolution on the scale of many meters to kilometers. And you can only do that in seismic. I've been to many outcrops where very simply, it's rare that you get 1 or 2 kilometers lateral outcrop. I can't think of anywhere in Indonesia, and therefore it's very hard to see really the details of sequences and nonconformities. So scale and resolution is important. Right, Walter's law. This law highlights the point that lithologies are often diachronous, particularly in Southeast Asia. All formations are diachronous in Southeast. Rare to find one that isn't. I know there's a few, but not many. Where a vertical facies sequence, such as shown here, does not represent the type of facies that were once connected, once laterally adjacent to each other, it indicates there's a break and there's what we call a non-Waltherian contact. So these are all Waltherian contacts. This is the normal sequence for Walter's law. What you originally had laterally, you find vertically in the section. So if you see this, you know nothing major has happened. If you see your lower shore face, middle shore face, upper shore face, that's a normal sequence. And if you see it in section, you see formations, which obviously should follow the lithologies. The formations will be diachronous, and there are many, many examples of this. Seismic data, though, gives few clues as to the age or the duration of deposits. In the 1970s, ESO tried hard to determine absolute ages of strata from seismic data. They tried from the nature of the sequences, by building on-lap patterns. However, they eventually realized it was not possible. Seismic data patterns are very poor at indicating the age, except in a few cases where you can use good interval velocity information. It doesn't work. This example is from Irian where there's a 60 million year hiatus here, 60 million years of hiatus, which really you wouldn't notice. What actually happened was the basin subsided, it went to basin starvation, there was no tilting, no tectonism, and 60 million years later, the deposition finally started coming into the basin again. Whereas if you have a bit of tectonism, it doesn't take much of a break to have an angular unconformity. You just tilt and you have an angular unconformity. So the size of an unconformity doesn't always tell you the age of the break. You have to be very careful. Seismic stratigraphy sequences and used to see a vast subject. I'm not going to, this isn't a talk on stratigraphy. It could be, but it's not. As shown here, the progradation of sediments into deep water is often, in fact, a large part of seismic stratigraphy is derived from looking at progradation and looking at sediment building into deeper water. Okay, sequences have evolved. A sequence is a local chronostratigraphic unit. It's a time-based unit. We've just said seismic horizons are time markers, and of course, unconformities are time markers. Young age might vary slightly due to differences in age above and below, but the age of the unconformity is fairly synchronous. To deeper water deposition, and these are called slugs. We call them, they were called slugs. As far as I know, they're still called slugs. You can see they evolved from 1977 here to 1987. They got a bit more complicated. And in the 1980s, we had core and outcrop went into sequence studies, academics got involved, and we then got sequence stratigraphy, which is somewhat complicated matters. But originally, when we did seismic stratigraphy, I can tell you exactly what we did. We weren't allowed to look at well data. We could only look at the seismic data. We had to pick sequence boundaries, and only after we'd completed a full integration of all the sequences were we then allowed to look at the well data, so that we didn't bias our interpretation. I don't think that's done anymore. So, same time that global eustatic sea level chart, at the same time as sequence stratigraphy, global sea level charts were also evolving. Bilal Haque took over from Vail and Co. in refining these charts in the 1980s. This is one from Bilal Haque in 1987. The unclear identification of relative changes in sea level from seismic data passed into the recognition. So originally they were based on what was meant to be relative changes of sea level, but we passed that into coastal onlap. So in other words, we were trying to identify coastal onlap from seismic. It was repeatedly argued that local tectonics were rarely important enough to mask or significantly change most of the sequence system track patterns, and therefore it allowed eustatic sea level to be seen and determined. That was the hypothesis. There's been serious criticism of global charts. Local areas can mask local tectonics, mask eustatic patterns. Hardenbull, who's referenced here, was very clear about this even in 1981. He said, quantifying eustatic sea level changes from measured changes in coastal onlap does not provide an accurate measure because of the variations in substance in different basins. We can see that very much in most basins in Southeast Asia. Just because you have a transgression of a coastline doesn't mean that the sea level rose. In fact, many times, if you have a transgression, it doesn't mean the sea level rose. So what Hardenbull said is entirely correct. And it's important that we try and, it's very hard to distinguish what might be a eustatic sea level from a local tectonic effect. More recently, this gentleman was looking at, he has stated very clearly that stacking patterns are predominantly driven by fluctuations in sediment supply, not by relative sea level change. So he's gone a bit further and said that even relative sea level isn't the driving factor. So it's getting a bit confused. Serious criticism of groan. This is a somewhat sarcastic comment in a recent book from this gentleman. If you read it, he says, he's saying oil companies are using it without knowing what they're doing. That's what he's saying. He's saying it doesn't work. That's quite a good book. It's got lots of different chapters if you haven't read it, of different subjects. It's not really integrated as a proper text. Now, for Southeast Asia, the absence of the so-called and most important Middle-Oligocene eustatic sea level drop, the Amplia Patura, which Peter Vail used to talk about every day. This was the major sea level drop in the middle of Oligocene, 300 meters or more of sea level drop. You don't see it in Southeast Asia. I have yet to see it anyway. If somebody knows where you can see a Middle-Oligocene 300-meter sea level drop in Southeast Asia caused by eustatic sea level changes, do let me know. Okay. Right. So in a recent IAGI lecture series that I participated in and in print, Bilal Haque has now accepted that tectonism overrides eustacy. So he's come out in print and in lectures to say this. So the idea that you can use snap to fit or events for all sequences by taking a cycle chart and applying it to your stratigraphy has now been pretty well shown to be in error. So please don't do it, and certainly don't do it for Southeast Asia. Please don't go trying to match these coastal onlap or sea level changes. These are meant to be sea level changes. They're not likely to match unless you are paying no attention to the real data. Quickly on geohistory. This is a modern important development. If you haven't used geohistory, I would suggest you do. It hasn't been fully absorbed. You did have a couple of years ago, Doug Wapples came, or rather he gave a talk to you all. So some of you would probably remember that. The first geohistory diagrams and geohistory analysis became possible because of the availability of good biostratigraphic data, zonation data for the Mesozoic and Cenozoic, and that was available in the 1970s. So you couldn't do geohistory before the 1970s. Also important was the improved ability to estimate depositional water depths, both water depth, subsidence, and uplift to be sensibly placed together. So the first geohistory was by Mr. Van Hint, or Hinte, and he did this in 1978. He kind of got overlooked because of the seismic sequence work, but his work was just as good, and he also worked for ESSO. So geohistory analysis was born. There was some precursors, but nothing that really is geohistory. This is a geohistory plot on the right. This is a geohistory. It integrates every aspect of stratigraphy so that you can fully understand the geological history of both a single location or even an entire basin. For unconformities, it requires not only that you identify the unconformity, but you must estimate the timing and duration, the layers affected, and the amount of erosion. That's where it starts to get tricky. That's where you start to have to really stop and think. You have to do a lot of work to get one of these diagrams. They don't just come out like a burial history of just simply plotting it. It's got to take into account everything that you can find out in the area, water depth estimates, and a range of other matters. It gives you an insight into geologic rates, the relationship of different features, and it also gives you new ideas. So it's well worth doing. It's hard to do. You can do it without the software, but there is very good software available from Doug. That's a plug for him. But you can draw them yourself. It's very enlightening to make one of these. It might take you a day to make one, but I would advise you try and do it because you realize what you don't know when you try and make one. Here's one from...
Sorry, Peter.
5 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Two major subsidence events are shown here and here. And we can see that the latest 16 million years ago, we still haven't filled the basin back up. This one almost filled up to sea level. And sometimes they do. Obviously, when you reach sea level, you tend to stay there for a while. This one didn't stay at sea level for very long before it subsided again very significantly. Subsidence in the order of 1 to 2 kilometers is very, in a short period of time, i.e. in the period of 1 or 2 million years, it's very easy to get 1 kilometer of subsidence in 1 million years. We now know that that's very normal. It's far more important than any eustatic sea level change. So you can go down 1 kilometer very easily in 1 million years. Okay. Here are some stratigraphic issues relevant to Indonesia and Southeast Asia. Just showing that that's a bit of a difficult map to understand. Lithostratigraphy and used as chronostratigraphy. Obviously, that's kind of a no-no, but it does happen. Nimbang is a good example. People use the Nimbang formation because we don't even know what the Nimbang formation is really. It's not properly defined to my knowledge, and we're using it for this entire sequence. So a name of a lithostratigraphic formation here is used to define the entire sequence. Maybe that's a good idea, maybe it isn't. I don't know, it's kind of odd, but the Nimbang is rather odd. Using geologic time with rocks, that is everywhere. Everywhere you go, you find lowers and uppers called geologic time. Lower and upper is not geologic time, it's stratigraphy, it's rocks, not time. On the right here, something similar, we have geologic time here shown as chronostratigraphy. Maybe that's slightly more acceptable, but so often people do not think whether they're talking about rocks or whether they're talking about time. What is well shown is the diachronism of the formations. We do know that in Southeast Asia, and it's well known in Southeast Asia, that huge amounts of diachronism occurred. There's some very good diagrams and very good work been done to show how diachronous the formations are. Just as another example, Sarawak cycles, just for your information, these are sequences, but they kind of didn't start out. They were numbered 1 to 8 from bottom to top. Unfortunately, they weren't defined in print. They still aren't. They were initially defined on well data from transgressive regressive cycles, but they've been integrated to seismic. So they've become the primary chronostratigraphic unit for Sarawak. So if somebody says cycle 1 and 2, they mean the lower part here of the lower Oligocene, lower Miocene of this. We don't use stages very often. I don't know anybody that regularly uses the international stage names in Southeast Asia. Interestingly, if you read London Madon 2017, these cycles do not match with global cycle charts, but I've told you that already, so you do that. Revitalizing stratigraphy, we need to really try and revitalize stratigraphy. It's got to become more scientific and evidence-based. Professor said this as well, so thank you very much for reiterating your point. You mustn't be reliant upon unsubstantiated ideas and doubtful events and model fitting. You've got to be sure of your data quality and accuracy. You've got to check your sources. Your stratigraphic sections are important. Obviously, they've got to expertly summarize data and facies and the uncertainty. And every basin should have a regional stratigraphic framework open to testing and modification. We obviously have a jumble of poorly defined, duplicated or missing names. Best if it can be resolved in understanding stratigraphic concepts. You've just heard from Professor on that, so thank you. Areas of like Southeast Asia demonstrate the frequent close link between stratigraphy and tectonism. You often see papers called tectonized stratigraphy, and that reflects the fact that tectonism is fundamentally important in Southeast Asia. It may not be in the Atlantic Ocean, but it is in Southeast Asia. Unconformities must be carefully studied and documented. That's something that really does need some more work, and data must be available for verification and testing. You know, the Sarawak cycles are not yet, no, the data wasn't released. So to finish, I'm suggesting some things you can do. Define formations, both old and new, with location, name, and primary lithology. You've got to make sure you define the once they're properly defined, then they're usable. Please try and separate rocks from time. Check always what you're talking about. Are you talking about the rocks or are you talking about time? Understand, map, and name important nonconformities. Define and, if necessary, name or number seismic sequences. That's not a bad idea. Most people, some companies do, some don't. Map and correlate formations as well as time rock units. This is important. You're actually, in many cases, interested in where a sand goes, and it doesn't follow a seismic horizon. So please don't continue a sand all the way across for 100 kilometers and think it goes under the same seismic horizon. It probably doesn't. Use geohistory to probe your tectonic and depositional history. That requires a lot of work, but it's time well spent. And avoid mindless matching of eustatic events to your basin stratigraphy. That really has become mindless rubbish. Please make stratigraphy a science. So that's a plea from me. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you for listening. I think that's it. I should have